Welcome to the Customary Land Podcast. I'm your host, Spike Boydell. The Customary Land Podcast is about all things relating to the equitable management of customary land. And I'm here today in the Adelaide Hills with Mike. Dr. Mike McDermott, who I've known for more than 20 years, is, like myself, has a valuation background, and like myself has been dealing with complex and complicated and sometimes straightforward, but normally complex issues on land and property for a large part of his career. So we'll start off, Mike, just a quick sort of minute on yourself, so the audience will know who we're a little bit more about your background and how you came to be dealing with property rights internationally, potted history.
Yeah, sure. Well, I trained as a valuer a very long time ago and began valuing. I first qualified back in the mid-70s as a valuer, and then I went overseas for a decade, travelling around the world, visiting countries, and my job when I was doing that was to explain the cultures and histories, etc., of the various places that we were visiting around the world, which gave me quite a lot of insights into different cultures, which coming from that time. Then I returned to Australia to resume my valuation career with a wife and a child in hand, and that continued for a while. I got back to work here in Adelaide, but then I always had in the back of my mind that I'd really like to combine my professional valuation practice with my travel experience. And so when the opportunity came up in a little country called Swaziland in southern Africa, now renamed Eswatini, I applied for the job and got the job. It was for a project by the World Bank called a Peri-urban project, with the idea of delivering services and to the people dwelling in the outskirts of the big towns in Swaziland. Now, that continued for a number of years, but I found myself doing quite a lot in Swaziland. I was seconded for all sorts of things besides the urban development project, and got a very broad view of governance in the land sector in the country, which deepened over time. And so this, by the way, was in the early 1990s. At that time, South Africa was just handling the transfer from F.W. de Klerk to Nelson Mandela, and so I got involved there a bit as well, and with the issues that were around that particular country. So I was invited by people from the British organisation DFID to become the National Land Policy Facilitator for Swaziland. And so I worked on that for quite a number of years until the Constitution came along and delayed the National Land Policy pending the deciding the institution, which was a perfectly sensible thing to do, because everything, of course, depends upon the Constitution. But what that did was to put me out of work for a while. So I then went to Vanuatu for a couple of years, and you remember, Spike, that's when we met. Yep.
2002 Land Tenure Conflict Symposium.
That's correct.
Funded by the RICS and the UNFAO.
Yeah. And so after that, I went to, I had a big operation, came back to Swaziland, and then got a job in Darwin back as a professional valuer. But at the same time, continued my international experience. And one thing that really worried me about the land policy was a conflict in Swaziland, which was really anathema to the traditional authorities there. They were absolutely adamantly opposed to introducing any leases on Swazi Nation land. So they actually put it in the Constitution that shouldn't happen. And when you look at things from an economically rational point of view, you think, why on earth would that happen? But the answer did not lie in economic rationality. The answer lay in historical trauma. Because when the Swazis had fought on the side of the British in the Zulu Wars, the thanks the British gave them was for the British concessionaries to actually take more land from the Swazis than the Swazis actually had. So they considered them to be highly treacherous, and there's no way they would ever deal with these people about land matters ever again. And so that gave me good cause for pause, and to a significant extent triggered the rest of where I am today.
Sort of subsequent 20 years of your career where you've morphed into an international land sort of policy consultant, and you've been involved in a number of projects, and we've collaborated on a number of things over the last couple of decades, which has been very, very enjoyable. What I wanted to lead into, perhaps, was, or maybe start with, was the issue with a project which you've been a main player in and I've been on the periphery on over the last few years, which is the whole evolution and discussions on what was always considered a very complicated or too hard issue, which was the valuation of customary land, but also in a wider sense for valuation of unregistered land. Because we've both been involved in many forums internationally, notably World Bank, UN, and FIG, where there's been a sense that freehold is best, and that it's really hard to deal with customary land because it doesn't get transacted or dealt with in the way that people from developed countries necessarily understand. It's that the sort of land issue has been long considered in some of the literature and in some of those international fora as a problem that we have customary land. And there's been a push from the, you may disagree with me, but a push from the land surveying geometician side that it becomes simpler to record, register, and title everything. And there was a push, I mean, you might know the history better than I, but a push, I suppose, since independence on a lot of countries, and since in the sort of, particularly the last 2 decades, to fund through donor agencies and national governments a level of land policy reform, shall we say, which in many ways has led to a titling project. But and there was historically in all those international fora a chart that used to get put out which had customary land at one end through various levels of informality to formality to leasehold to freehold as the optimum solution. The sort of arrow went towards freehold, and there's been a breakaway on that, or a correction, should I say, on that in recent times, which I'd like you to get into in a moment. But sort of first, that whole wider issue of, and coming back to the valuation of unregistered land project, it would be interesting from your perspective to get your insights on what led to that project and how you've sort of come up with your ideas and outcomes and findings and recommendations from that project, which I think partly, correct me if I'm wrong, was GLTN, the Global Land Tools Network, and UN, perhaps initially, but you've been involved as well from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors side of things.
And FIG.
And the International Federation of Surveyors. So, can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. The point is that the revised way of looking at things is the fitness for purpose of different forms of tenure. And there are some tenures that are optimal in some environments and other tenures that are optimal in other environments. This particular question was the genesis of my trying to define problem spaces in different ways. Right now, for example, the world is in an entirely new configuration regarding the urban-rural divide. GLTN is mainly concerned with the vast peri-urban spaces which are tiny in Swaziland, where we're not addressing them, but they're absolutely huge around the world, such that a large majority of children born on the planet are being born in these mega cities, these vast urban conglomerates where the holdings are informal and people need services. So the old adage of the irresistible force of globalization meeting the immovable object in terms of traditions and the like applies in this particular space. And that kind of dichotomy involved a great deal of emotion from parties that are caught up in it all. And in particular, the compulsory acquisition of properties in order to deliver infrastructure to these vast conglomerates and to cities and so on, can cause a great deal of conflict upon conflict, because even where the surveying is in a perfect condition and everybody's regards land as a commodity, if you try to take somebody's house, they can usually get very upset about it and try to stop you or try to bleed you for the max in terms of the compensation they receive. So casting around for these kinds of problem spaces, they were what's called a wicked problem. And so there are 4 problem spaces that I consider need to be considered in these sorts of environments. I'm talking here about the valuation of unregistered land. The first type of problem is a simple problem. There are simple aspects to these things. And if you read a recipe book, it's like baking a cake. You just need to follow the recipe and you'll get your result. The second type of problem space is complicated problem space. Here we're talking about systems. Here we're talking about projects like building a dam or sending a rocket to the moon or something like that, where you need hierarchies, you need military type order with pecking orders, and they can be very efficient in terms of the resolution of complicated problems. But there's another order entirely from those systemic and complicated problems when you start dealing with organisation, in particular organic organisations such as people and groups of people, and that's where you enter the complex problem spaces. There's a little law called the Harvard Law of Animal Behaviour, which basically says put an animal in carefully controlled conditions with everything well and truly sorted out, and the animal will do pretty much what it damn well likes. That's because we operate in a non-linear way of doing things, and involving whole sets of value judgments, which continually in a processual form, which is not the case with a complicated problem. You have the problem. Your value is to solve the problem mechanically, and away you go, and it's all nice. That is not the case with complex problems. And then you get wicked problems. Now, wicked problems can have aspects of simple, complicated, and complex problems in them, but they have one identifying characteristic, and that is they can't ever be resolved. You try one thing and you're in a sort of whack the mole situation, a problem pops up somewhere else. And then you deal with that one and pops up, two problems pop up over here and there and everywhere. So you're in a situation there where you can't win. You can't, if you can win, if you can solve the problem, it was never a wicked one in the first place. But when you're talking about the irresistible force and the immovable object, when you're talking about all of these high emotions, or when you're talking about time limits, whereby things have to be met by, and you've got a whole chaotic mess to deal with, you're talking wicked problem spaces. So the question then is, you can get lost in that mire of messes forever and never reach a resolution. So from the point of view of due diligence for a valuer or any other professional faced with wicked problem spaces is, what comprises due diligence for performance in wicked problem spaces? Now, from a valuer's perspective, when we're talking about the valuation of unregistered land, myself and other valuers are saying that due diligence should be the optimal performance of international valuation standards in that space, and that space then involves cognizance of the broader issues. In other words, it is no longer sufficient for a valuer to just walk in and say, this place is worth 10,000 or whatever it happens to be. They need to say, this place is worth 10,000, but there's a wicked problem space here that needs to be addressed. And just as we do, for example, with contaminated sites or many other issues that are beyond the competence and training of a professional valuer, we have a duty to point these matters out to our clients as part of our due diligence in performing the valuation itself. So the problem is, it's not a clear dividing line between complex and wicked, and between any of them really. These are just orienting generalizations. So there will be situations where monetary compensation will be sufficient, even though the matter of compensation you would think had nothing whatsoever to do with money. And so one needs an understanding of the environment to make that call. It's no good just for a valuer to walk into an unregistered land and say, now see here, I'm the expert and this is what it should be worth. One needs to have an understanding of the broader issues to act in accordance with the market value definition, which involves knowledge, involves prudence, involves acting without compulsion, and to meet those definitions in the context of unregistered land, one's knowledge must be sufficient to meet the market value definition.
But in terms of that market value, I think that's one of the points that had often been highlighted when people said, well, actually, there is a market. The land is already being transacted at a localized level. It's just when you perhaps involve the state for compulsory acquisition or for, and I'm thinking here of some of my personal experience in Fiji, where there were a lot of informal settlements, which there in Fiji the colloquial term for them was squatter settlement. And the government was continually trying to regularize the circumstances. So they would take tranches of land, and often, and that's one of the issues that gets highlighted, is in many countries, the more formalized land tends to be in the more structured urban areas, and it and certainly from a Pacific context, we can see in Port Vila, where you've just been for the last couple of weeks, in Vanuatu, the fact that there is a level of structure and regularization within the Port Vila Council and also in the sort of larger cities or towns, should I say, in other parts of the country. And the same in Fiji, where I've got sort of 11 urbanized, recognized areas with councils. And there's more structure, generally speaking, to the land. And in some cases, it has been registered. And there is a level of title that's questionable how that was done under colonization originally. But there are tranches in some countries. Here I'm referring to Fiji in particular, where there is some freehold land, which was created really for the settlers, the colonial settlers. But then we've got the structure of a more regulated rental structure where people are taking leases from either the government or from customary landowners, which has some form of, generally speaking, registration to it. But then we have a situation where there are vast tranches of land which, because historically the economic concentration, I suppose, has been in those urban areas, or in the development of a port, which has been done by the government, so it's been done or an airfield, it's been done in the auspices, or a school, or a hospital. It's been done under the auspices of the government, and likewise roads and other infrastructure. So with the sort of evolution, where I was going with the comment about informal settlements and squatting in urban areas, for example, in Fiji, no sooner does the government attempt to create a sense of formality and either regularize those squatter settlements in some way, or enable people who are currently in those squatter settlements to move into something that the government
more formal
has regulated them, then the whole nature of urban development means other people are coming in to fill in those spaces. So it's a sort of wicked problem in as much as it just perpetuates. But the dynamic are that and the point I was making before, I suppose, was this sense that from a valuation perspective, well, there was a level of transaction, because when those people move in and take over those spaces, they are either compensating somebody within the informal settlement, or compensating somebody,
a slumlord, for example.
Who's moved out. And there's the issue, obviously, that some people within urban areas are settling on what is deemed government land. Others are on land that might be customary land, that may or may not be within the formal administration in the Fiji context of something like the Itauke Land Trust Board, Native Land Trust Board. So there has been evidence historically of value in that informal sector.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So in terms of then if we take it I guess to a wider scale, which is where the valuation of unregistered land sort of emanated from, was it more for the big infrastructure development, or where there are developers, be it for tourism or for forestry or for mining, that there was a sort of a way that the government as intermediary would try and compensate the customary landowners, but you can't compensate supposedly or easily someone for land which is seen as owned, communally and perpetually. So,
yeah, well, firstly, as you know, the World Bank conferences are suspended indefinitely. But in 2019, one of the most hard-nosed economists in terms of land, Klaus Diesinger, how do you pronounce it?
Klaus Diesinger,
Diesinger, from the World Bank, recognised the need for the recognition of communal tenure and things of that nature. But yeah, markets have been around for millennia. Markets have been around before the human species even existed between different animals. I mean, the monetary value arises in situations of supply and demand in preference to violence and war. If a person can knock another person on the head and take their land, then they might do that. But if they can't, then they have to negotiate with them. And a market valuer's job is to see that the transaction happened in a normative fashion that can then be used as evidence of a transaction typical of that particular market space. And this has been going on in areas of market supply and demand at least since ancient Sumer. They had land markets there. It's a city thing. In the old days, when we didn't have the populations we have now, there was lots and lots of land for people. Now there's very little land at all. So now the market has become much more predominant because you're then faced with a choice of an exchange, often faced with a choice, not always, of war and stealing the land or entering into an agreement as close to the market value definition as is practicable in the circumstances. So this is all happening at the same time.
Yeah, but you see, the market value is a Western construct to a degree. Market valuation is more of a Western construct because it's.
Let me stop you there. The story of Jesus. We're just talking before about a book I had there which mentioned Jesus. He was betrayed by Judas, and for 40 pieces of silver. Judas went off and hung himself. And what happened then? The Jewish priest bought a place with the 40 pieces of silver for a cemetery. Now that was way before capitalism. The point is that capitalism is and the whole post-enlightenment thing is something not on top of market value. Market value is on top of it. Market value has a precedent going back millennia. There have always been market value agreements between parties, just the same as there's always been wars between parties. So I don't agree with the contention that market value is a Western concept. I believe it is I consider it to be a human relationship. So the point is, even though you're quite right about the provenance of the definition of market value, its applicability, I believe, to be global. When you have a fair deal between people, you're really, when you want to assess it, the market value definition will come in quite usefully, given the necessity for prudence and for knowledge and all the fair marketing and so on. One thing the market value definition doesn't maybe emphasise strongly enough is the power differential between people, and the fact that when you're talking an agreement between the parties, given their prudence and so on, it's always between the willing seller and the wealthiest or the person with the most disposable income as a buyer is concerned. So the question then is what happens to the underbidder or to other people who have motivations that are just as strong or stronger than the people with a wherewithal. Because for any market value transaction, you need motive, means, and opportunity. And so as the people with the motive, means, and opportunity manage to buy a property and property values go up, then you get a difference in the wealth between the person who's purchased the land and the person who wanted it just as much or more, but was unable to obtain it. So these issues are quite relevant when it comes to expropriation, insofar as when I was talking about the principle of equivalence, the whole purpose of that is to, when it comes to the market value part of it at least, is to give the people enough money to go off and find another place to live in somewhere else. That's the purpose of it. And there's an implicit assumption there that there is a place just like it that can be purchased for that, which, given the very opaque and unaccountable markets that often exist in the developing world, is a rather questionable assumption upon which to base any transaction.
Well, especially when we think whose land is the land that they could go to, because all land is notionally, I won't say owned, because we're not talking ownership in a Western sort of concept of ownership. Quite often we're talking about guardianship and stewardship of land over multiple generations from a customary context. And
the people are buried there too. The ancestors are part of the soil.
And the current community are there both, yes, as guardians of the spirits of their ancestors, but they're also there to protect the land for the generations yet to come. So there's to manage the land for the generations. Well, when I say protect, I mean manage the land for generations yet to come. So the idea in a registered land society, yes, you might. Let's look at Australia or the UK or the US. There's the sense that when you have compulsory acquisition of land, and it's being used, let's say, for a public purpose rather than to enable mining or whatever, but it's primarily for roads or schools or hospitals or infrastructure. And people are, someone lives in a house, they've got title to the house, and there's perhaps a road widening scheme. It's taking in a particular location 15 or 20 properties, because the rest of the land might be rural, but we're looking at people with a house, a home. We'll take that example. Then your idea of compensation and equivalence holds true, because there will always be other properties which are up for sale. You never are able to overcome some of that attachment, because a couple may have grown up there, or take your own property. But we're here in Burnham Bray. You have a sense of place.
That's a strong emotional attachment.
A strong emotional attachment to this place. So if there was a road going through, you'd be compensated for your bricks and mortar equivalence, but not for your disturbance and for packing everything up, supposedly. But you would not be compensated for your emotional attachment.
Well, that's because I can't buy and sell it. I mean, I can't say, well, I feel really bad about this. So the point would be that I would not want to ever want to sell it, right? So that's why. That's right.
But the example is, your house is being taken because it's needed
for a school or whatever,
or road widening. So it's not that you'd never sell it. It's being acquired. Okay, so the principle of equivalence.
The principle of equivalence.
Tell me about principle of equivalence for you, and this is a Western dynamic, and what I want to do is then try and carry this idea back to the customary. So I'm using you here as an example, Mike.
Market value does involve a willing buyer and a willing seller. What would make me a willing seller? Nothing. I would not be a willing seller. Why would I not be a willing seller? Because they're really get out of jail words which I really don't like in our culture. One of them is externalities, which economists use all the time. And the other is sentimentality. Now, the people who use the word sentimentality should be able to explain to the people they're calling sentimental what the difference is between sentimentality and necessary but insufficient factors of identity construction. In other words, if you identify with something or some other person, is love then sentimentality? Right. So when it comes to me here, by loving this place as I do, I can gain an empathic understanding of attachment to land, which is, again, not simply something that humans have, but most animals have a territory, right? And this is their place, which is one of the things that De Soto mentioned. Every dog knows the boundary of their place. We have the dogs out there, they know where my land ends even when there's no fence there. So the point there is that we have these evolutionary robust feelings, emotions in us, and to dismiss them as sentimentality or externalities is insolent when it comes to the principle of equivalence. The law has recognised this in terms of the head of compensation term solatium.
Yeah.
They realise that people have an attachment to place and that wrenching them from that place will hurt them in terms of their identity, because a fundamental component of their identity has been involuntarily taken from them. So they provide money as a form of solace. One of the statements of Aristotle that I like is that the source of all enmity is the feeling of being slighted. And if you're expropriating properties from people, you're adding insult to injury by means of saying, well, your feelings are externalities, they are mere sentimentality, get out of the way, be gone. Now, in our society of commodification of houses,
A house is a house.
a house is a house is a house, that's not such a big injury. We generally think that we can find another place just like it, and we have the money, we can buy that place over there. And oh, look, that's a nice place. I get to like that place just as I like this place. When it comes to customary holdings, however, that cannot be assumed at all. There's a gentleman, a scholar called Professor Emeritus, I think now, of Thaler Scudder, an American anthropologist, who did some studies on the people whose land was taken from them in Laos for the construction of dams. And even though relevant boxes were ticked, there's complete societal collapse, as indeed happened with the Ick of Uganda and some other many places that happened, which is a legitimate, in my view, head of compensation different from solatium about attachment to place. Because also in these areas, particularly peri-urban areas and in on customary land, there are networks of relationships which are not merely sentimental. They are socio-cultural and economic networks that exist in such areas. You know, I will grow some yams, and you over there, that's a better place to grow. Your place is better for growing bananas. We'll exchange yams and bananas, and so there's this whole network of mutual reinforcing regard, hunger, satisfaction, economic relationships, environmental care, socio-cultural rituals. All of these things can be completely destroyed by pushing not just a rug from out under them, but the land that the rug is on from under them. And there's no head of compensation for that. They talk about the value of the land, they talk about injurious affection, severance, disturbance, and so on, and solatium, but nothing for the network. No, that's not right, in terms of the principle of equivalence. So that's why most of the major donors have a preference for a land exchange. And so do I. But the problem is the world is getting extremely crowded. And isn't very much spare land just waiting around for somebody to come and buy it. Usually it's occupied by someone else. And then when you get, say, 50 people or 100 people or 1,000 people being removed from one place, what happens to the market when they get moved? They've all got this money, and suddenly the supply is the same, the demand goes up, the values go up. When you're valuing at a particular date, suddenly those values are no longer relevant, right? So here we're entering the wicked problem space that happens with compulsory acquisition. We have to get real about it and recognise these that people who are in situations such as that should not be treated in the same manner as if they are merely complicated machines or something of that nature, because, again, the feeling of being slighted alienates people terribly. And most of these public works that are required are there to help people, not to ruin people's lives. And so the whole point there is that the people whose properties are taken from them should be given the same beneficence as those for whom the infrastructure is for. In fact, even more so, because they are more disturbed by it. So those are the sorts of issues that I believe you can transfer from our formal economy to the customary and other forms of informal relationships, land tenure, on the understanding that we're all human beings. We are not machines. Machine is a very useful metaphor, but I have many of my machines locked in that room over there for 25 years. I take them out and I turn them on. If I was locked in that room for 25 years, you might take me out, you might turn me on, but not a lot is going to happen.
I might try to turn you on.
Yeah. So the point I'm getting to is that a sheer stupidity, a monumental absurdity to reduce complex to complicated. It's an obscenity. And it happens all the time when it comes to expropriation. You object over there, you are in our way, get away, because here we come. And valuers often have little tables which have absolutely no relationship anymore to the principle of equivalence in terms of being able to find an equivalent amount of land somewhere else. Yet they have a problem. The valuers have a problem. And the government officials have a problem, because they have people looking over their shoulder and saying, why are you paying more than that is on that form? And they say, well, because the person will not be able to get an equivalent property for that amount of money. And then the bean counter says, no, I know what's going on with you two. You have reached an agreement whereby you pay him more money and you get a kickback. And the person, and so we are going to put you in jail because we think you are corrupt. So, because it is not what is said on the form. So you have the bureaucratic mentality making value judgments for which they have no competence at all. So that's why it's important for the due diligence line to be drawn somewhere in wicked problem situations. And that's why I've come up with this HVN, HBA approach to provide a protocol whereby due diligence can be attained. We know with wicked problems they're never going to be resolved by definition, but we also know there must be some form of behaviour which is the best that can be done at the time. And so what is the form of behaviour that is the best that can be done at the time to satisfy the people worried about the government budget, to satisfy the people whose land has been taken from them, and to satisfy the people who are charged with that process? And so that's where I'm at right now. So when it comes to the valuation of unregistered land, international valuation standards have been adjusted recently with a view to enfolding situations such as that.
You say adjusted, they've evolved to reflect the fact that you can't use pure policy prescription to resolve such matters, presumably.
Yes, they've opened themselves up to a more a broader remit than simply the formal economic behaviour. So, for example, in the 2022 version, they've established 14 principles about what a valuation should contain, or what behaviour should be conducted, in order to not only perform due diligence, but with the 14th principle, have it on record as to the what you have done, the same way as we do in a normal valuation process. You keep things on file for years, and you even archive them for years longer, so that if any problems arise later, you as a valuer can give a clear account of what you did, and providing you that can be shown to have been due diligence at the time, you are in the clear. And if it doesn't, then you must take the penalty. So the point is, these are tried and true methodologies for millions and millions of valuations, extracted from millions of valuations in the commercial sector, and which I consider, from my experience, as do other people from their experiences, that they could be robust in this new space of customary land and unregistered land. So it would be lovely if customary land could be kept exactly the way it is. And what is happening now in law, particularly in international comparative law, people are calling for spectrums of law in a particular domain when it comes to tenure, so that different systems of tenure can coexist in the same state. Which means that the state needs to get away from its delusions of grandeur and realise it's there to serve the people, including people who don't agree with the formal methods of land tenure, and be facilitators of arrangements made by individuals acting in accordance with the market value definition, even if it's not involving a market value transaction. People who are knowledgeable, prudent, acting without compulsion, in whatever domain it happens to be, that they should be recognised for what they are, a legitimate form of exchange.
Now, this might be a slight tangent to it, but if we were to look at, I don't know, some sort of mineral exploration situation, we have a lot of quite horrendous examples here in Australia in recent years of licenses being granted, presumably by the state, for mineral exploration over land, and then we've seen the destruction of some very, very old artifacts.
Okay.
Now, we also see situations, and this is not just in the Pacific, but we've seen it sort of in other places in the world as well, particularly developing countries, where the power balance isn't necessarily as strong as the sort of compensation issues, and we're different attachment. But we see situations where land is taken, and I want to question really this taking of land as opposed to
land grabbing, you mean?
Well, no, taking of land for mineral exploration, but then it tends to be a complete taking, as opposed to saying, well, what we're going to do, because we still have our emotional attachment place, and we appreciate that we can potentially be co-beneficiaries because there are resources on our land, unless there's the perception that the land, that resources are owned by the state. But then you get into that other conundrum that within a customary context, people have understood that they are the guardians from the centre of the earth to the highest heavens, as opposed to the Western definition, which is you've got access to the top 6 feet or a couple of meters of land. So the situation where we could take the Solomon Islands as an example, or
Vanuatu or something.
That if that mine is going to happen, and you can't stop development. There's a reason why it's being, but there is a demand for that resource. Compensate the owners. As you know, Ulai Bayer and I put out a proposal that would allow for a compensation system that made the customary guardians. I struggle with the word customary land owners because we get into concepts of that's what they're known as, but it's this guardian stewardship relationship which we're compensating and dealing with. But you get into a situation where rather than a complete taking, so that their customary rights are for all intents and purposes extinguished because it's the government have intervened and then passed over access to that land to a mining company. What is the situation, or what are the options for us to actually create a leasehold structure for that mining system, and within that leasehold structure, make the customary landowners partners, but also make them partners in such a way to ensure that the mining companies do right by the customary landowners, which hasn't happened as we've seen in places like Goldridge in the Solomon Islands, where the mining company sold the mine site back to the customary landowners, guardians, for $100, but left them, as a result, did the dirty, and there's this whole compensation for the contamination, and a very weak dam, a tailings dam, but could spill further down and ruin lifestyles further downstream. How do we preclude those sorts of things happening within the realms of the acquisition?
Yes, well, that's that again. A solution such as you referred to, whereby you have the leases and so on, means that was not actually a wicked problem, it was a complex problem, because it was capable of resolution in that manner. But then you might go for the same attempt of exactly the same formula elsewhere and find it doesn't work. And then you think, well, maybe there's a complex, another methodology that would work here. But whatever happens, you've actually got a peaceful resolution of a complex problem by means of these leases and things of that nature. And obviously you've got to look for that. But my focus here is on wicked problems and where there is no possibility of any resolution. And that's where the idea of citizen assemblies leading to value juries, where people of their peers, not the people themselves, but peers of the parties involved, can be fully informed and make a decision, which then can be put before the parties involved as a potential solution. And the whole idea of Talbot's with his what is called collaborative action inquiry, I believe, is very useful in application to the wicked problem space, so that no single person is knowledgeable or wise enough to address all the multifarious issues, all the multidisciplinary involvements in wicked problem spaces. So dictators, autocrats, etc., say this is all too much, it's going to be like this, get out of our way, and think that somehow that isn't going to cause a conflict, but it's going to cause a conflict. And I've got thousands of years of precedents to demonstrate that. We have one of the major people that I'm referring to in my work is Ian McGilchrist, who talks about the behaviour of our left hemispheres and our right hemispheres in different spaces. When it comes to McGilchrist's insights into as applies to addressing wicked valuation problems, as I said, I'm talking about sensitising people to the particular paradigm that he refers to from his studies in psychiatry and in neuroscience and the like, in two books, the Master and His Emissary, which was published in 2009, and the Matter with Things, which was published in 2021. Both of them are riffs on a particular theme, and that theme is the fact that the brain operates on both hemispheres all the time. It's a 24/7 process, but they're looking for different things when they're talking about when they're doing this processing of information. Fundamentally, our brains, or if you want to be more accurate about it, our minds, are pattern seekers and reality inhibitors. We are looking for patterns. We sometimes invent patterns that aren't there, but we inhibit a lot of things all the time. Like you and I are focusing now on our conversation. I'm not focusing on that statue. I do get information there coming into my system, but I ignore it.
Just as I've got all the tech.
Yeah, that's right. So the point is that when it's going through that process of inquiry, such as the collaborative developmental action inquiry process of that Bill Talbot recommends, I'm saying that can be well facilitated by McGilchrist's insights, insofar as we have our left hemisphere looking for manipulation and our right hemisphere looking for understanding. Now, when it comes to the processes of the way that things should behave according to McGilchrist, is the right hemisphere looking for understanding should be the master, and the left hemisphere looking for manipulation should be the emissary. And yet in Western culture, it is so often the other way around. The machine mind, the mechanical, what's called a mega machine of globalization, which is as the opposite of planetization that Lewis Mumford referred to. So the utility of the two hemispheres we have goes back to the other mammals and so on with bicameral minds. For example, a little bird, when it's looking for pieces of something edible in the dirt, is very focused there. But if that was all the little bird would be doing, then he might be pounced upon by a cat or something, or he might miss his beautiful female bird just flying off in the distance there somewhere. And so he needs to be able to have the broad vision as well as the focus vision in order to survive in any evolutionary environment. And we're like that. So we go from data to information. Information being a difference that makes a difference in the data for the particular thing we're talking about, particular circumstances we're talking about. After information, we have knowledge, and after knowledge, we then go into understanding. Now, with understanding, you can understand a machine without any relationship to emotions, as I mentioned before. But
I
you
don't
can't.
know, Mike. I find I get pretty emotional relationships with the tech when it doesn't work well for us. But maybe that's just my that's probably something quite different. That's just me, my frustration that.
Well, I find swearing quite often works.
Yes, it does. Yes, well, we've had a bit of that as we've been navigating through our recordings. So yes.
So apart from magic words, where swearing actually gets the machine to do what you want it to do, apart from things like that,
hitting them.
Hitting them works as well.
Yeah, but computers always. Strike lightly.
That's right. And so we, from an evolutionary perspective, apply those tactics, which sometimes actually work in the complex problem space. And of course, a classical example of that in terms of the complicated space was Alexander the Great with the Gordian knot. I don't know if you remember that story or not, but the idea being there's this very, very complicated knot. And the legend was that the person who could unravel a knot would rule Asia. So Alexander goes ka-shunk with his sword and it all falls apart and he goes on and rules Asia. But that's a complicated problem. If you're trying to negotiate with someone and you go ka-shunk with a sword, you're being a bit reductionist about the person.
Or the problem,
yes. So we've all got to step up, I think, to the realization that complicated is not complex, and that there's a very, very big difference between these in the nature of these four problematic. We're always looking in terms of homeostasis towards not being unduly troubled. Well, sorry, the way the world is now, we have to be unduly troubled about wicked problems. We have to be unduly troubled about multipolar traps, which is another area where if people break agreements, then everybody has to break the agreement, otherwise they get destroyed by the breaker of the agreement. Those sorts of issues can give us a spiraling down into war, as has currently happened in the Ukraine. And that's I'm not saying these things can always work, but what I am claiming is the articulation and differentiation of these various problem spaces and the accompanying recommendations towards the optimal way of addressing them is something that is vital for the survival of the human species. And so when, for example, I'm talking about values, market values are just one form of values. Market values swim in a sea of different values. And those values influence the market, and the market influences those values. So that when one's talking about a willing buyer and a willing seller, what makes them willing? We have this absurd model of the reasonable man in the West dealing with other people as objects and so on in a very schizoid manner. And by the way, McGilchrist in the Matter of Things, being a psychiatrist, strongly suspects that Descartes was schizoid because he used to merrily dissect dogs just to prove they were machines, and including his wife's pet dog. I mean, that's more than a little bit strange. That's because he was objectifying everything, just the same as people do when they're expropriating their property. That's schizoid. We need
Schizoid.
Schizoid,
Yeah.
So what we need to do is to get away from this machine-looking thing as being, which is fine for simple, fine for complicated, but can lead to massive problems when misapplied to complex and wicked situations. Sure, kids need rules. You've got to, so rules come from the simple and the complicated space. But kids cannot be enfolded by rules. You can't put a kid in a rules box, because if you do, you destroy them. Kids need cuddling. Kids need loving and affection, and they need guidance and all
structure. Yeah.
And structure. So you've got that. The kids are complex, and they can, when they get to be teenagers, generate wicked problems every which way, as we parents are only too aware. But we have to be aware of that's what they are, because otherwise we get what's called limbic capture, and we go back and say, well, bugger you, this is the way things are, and we reduce a complex organism to a complicated machine, because the complexity is all too hard for our tiny brains to deal with. Well,
which is actually an interesting segue, because earlier you made reference to the HBA, HBN, and just sort of glossed over it. And I think in sort of pulling this together, I'm going to spruik your book for you. So that's what happens on podcasts and videos sometimes.
Yeah.
So I'll put a link to the book here, which is where you coalesce the state of play that you got to for your doctoral research, and subsequently where you started applying or trying to navigate how we were dealing with these problems on land. And you, in fact, I recall you testing the HBA/HBN in Solomon Islands with dealing with their particular land problems, which was probably in 2015 or so. I'll put a link in, as I say, to the book for those who want to read further on it. But and this is where I'm going to be really rude and really offend you, because I'm going to say, so Mike, just in 60 seconds, encapsulate the dilate and I mean this is the whole nature of the issue. How do we distill everything into something that you've called the HBA/HBN? But can you sort of elaborate on that a little bit, and then how that, because I know this is something at the time that we're recording this in late October 2022, that in November 2022 you're actually presenting
for the first time
in its entirety. And since you worked it through, you've subsequently worked on a number of international land policy projects that have allowed you to, I suppose, test, refine, develop, evolve, because it's continually iterative. But for those who haven't yet read it, and I urge you all to rush out and order it through Routledge, so you make Mike an incredibly wealthy author with his fractional percentage that comes from royalties. Yeah, but it's the encapsulation of
I can probably try that, Spike.
Because I know you're going to have to do that within a presentation fairly soon.
Well, yes. And so basically, when I mentioned about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of McGilchrist, as far as I'm concerned, it could be the left toe and the right toe. It doesn't matter to me about this. We're talking about.
Well, we're not talking about McGilchrist. I mean,
I am. Let me talk about McGilchrist.
Except we're talking about McDermott. We're talking about McDermott's ideas, not and yes, McGilchrist is informed in some ways, and so the multiplicity. But what is the distillation of McDermott?
Yeah, that's where I'm leading to, Spike. Okay. The point of HVN is the right hemisphere. HBA is work for the left hemisphere. So the HVN is process philosophical. The HBA is static philosophical. So with one, you're dealing with the constantly changing environment that you have in addressing wicked problems by definition. And the other, you're pinning the butterflies to the wall to try to make better sense of them, the same way as when you have a machine, you stop and think about how it should be working. In other words, the HBA is for manipulation, the HVN is for understanding. So that's why McGilchrist is important, because of the fact that he provides that not dichotomy,
but the language of HBA/HVN is McDermott, or is McDermott?
It's McDermott, because what I'm talking about.
That's what
okay. So HVN is its own. That's the master. What I'm talking about now is not. I don't want to go there. It basically means hierarchical vortex in heterarchical fields, but that doesn't mean anything to most people, but that's fine, because whatever it meant is static. and we're talking about process.
And dynamic.
However, when it comes to HBA, we can pin down the words much more accurately. HBA stands for high degree bias analysis. High degree meaning they're analysing people in terms of 6 dimensions: their mental character, their personality, their mind, their will, their emotions, as what I call soma, their physical capacities in terms of that was soma, the mental capacity, psyche, and the skill sets. In the skill sets go to the products they can be expected to produce. The psyche goes to the cultural and artistic and all those sorts of things, and the physical goes to the nature because it's a nature space. So that provides a framework which I call the Habermasian framework, or the Hextall framework.
Hextall.
Hextall, Hextal.
Yep.
A hextant is a 6-fold division, and as a way of manipulating for the left hemisphere to work these things out. And then it's got to look at the identity of the identity construction of the people involved, the developmentals, the developments, the Goldilocks zone. In other words, people develop at a certain pace. The pace varies from person to person. Too much and nothing can be achieved because the people get too anxious. Too little and nothing will be achieved because the people get too bored. And then related to evolution. Now, evolution happens without a obstacle to address. That's the high degree part of it.
Yep.
Yeah. Then bias is to be awake for black swans and be aware that things can go wrong all the time. And then you've got 3 forms of value. Intrinsic value, what the value is of something in itself in terms of its levels of developmental complexity in whatever field it's in. Like, for example, a well-constructed scientific article is of greater intrinsic value than is some guy sitting on a couch drinking beer and thinking, well, I think this, right? There's an intrinsic difference. Extrinsic value is what can be done with something, and systemic value is a value within the system itself. Now, Marx had a different breakup, but I won't go to Marx because we haven't got time, and anyway, I don't have a great deal of regard for that particular, because all of his values were subsets of extrinsic value. He had nothing about either systemic or intrinsic values when he was talking about his types of values. And then and then the Dallas part, which is all dimensions and of a property, or level of a situation, or levels of a situation, or scales of a situation.
All
scales. For example, with Adam Smith, as I mentioned to you before, when Adam Smith was talking about nails and things of that nature, he was talking the small tradesman. That you can't blow the scales of a relationship that happen with small tradesmen up to in multinational corporations. They operate at a different scale, meaning they're all fundamentally different in kind because of the nature of scale. And I mean, for example, in the physical side of things, an ant is a completely different structure because of his scale to us, and there's only so far that bones can support an animal on the surface of the earth, but with the extra support of the sea, whales can grow very, very large. So there's a whole lot of matters, a plethora of matters that can be looked at in terms of trying to achieve what is due diligence for a wicked problem set in the circumstances one is faced with.
That's the high degree Biodalis. Yeah.
And then when it comes, the HVN that's the understanding part of our McGilchrist mind. So with simple and complicated to understand. Complex and wicked are complex and wicked to understand. So there are different kinds of understanding for both of those problems. And what we often do is we conflate the two. But you can't understand a child by measuring its height. I mean, it's like You need to be able to apply the right tool for the right task. Like Colin does some things very well, a spanner does other things very well. It's the same with thoughts. We need to have the mental tools fit for the particular purpose that we need to address a wicked problem with.
So our acronym HVN
is the hierarchical vortex network in heterarchic field. Now, the term hierarchy means a whole part. It was Arthur Coase thought of it. And when it comes to organisms, we are, in fact, the whole universe, including artifacts, is in relationships. There's nothing that is completely isolated.
Which is exactly our point with land.
Yes, exactly. And then the vortex is the dynamism, right? The whole processual nature of these things. Like when we're talking,
it's not static. It's dynamic.
It's dynamic, yeah. So while you and I are talking here, there's a baby being born in Botswana. There's a person being murdered over in Afghanistan. There are zillions of things happening right now, and we have our own little focus here between us. But these processes are going on all over the place.
So it's the fact you can't take
everything into account,
everything into account, but you can't take individual things in isolation, or you can't take this in isolation of the fact it's part of a whole.
That's correct. So, for example, Carl Sagan says, if you want to bake an apple pie, first create a universe, because you need the apples to be created. You need the recipe book to be created. You need the oven to be created. You need all these sorts of things. Even though there's a simple problem to bake an apple pie, it is dependent upon the environment providing all the ingredients for the simplicity to be. And when it comes to, for example, I mentioned the BIS, the BIS, BIES, as well as the black swans. There is something. I have a master's, in complexity and chaos. Something called the
butterfly. You said that too fast for me, so it would be too fast.
Okay. Complexity and chaos theories in the terms of their application to social environments. And the other B that I was mentioning is, as well as the black swans, the unexpected, is the butterfly effect.
Yes.
So that in just a small change in initial conditions can iteratively blow out into very, very major changes once the iterations get further and further down the track. So we need to respect complexity and live our lives not so much one of homeostasis, meaning keeping ourselves together, though we need that. But what we need is another word called homeostasis, which is flow, developing in terms of Goldilocks. We're having an interesting life, not just a static, boring sort of sitting there like some limpet, but one where we can collaboratively, developmentally inquire in the methodologies that Bill Talbot is talking about, and be aware when we're doing that of the dynamic interplay between the master and his emissary when it comes to what we should be applying our understanding to manipulate and learn from that manipulation deeper understanding. It's a process, and that process is where we are most alive. There's a psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi talks about that. It's very, very simple. Vertical axis is stress. Horizontal axis is boredom. Development only happens in a line where you get this feeling of flow, where the best moments in your life are spent trying to achieve something difficult and worthwhile. And when you want difficulty, wicked problems are a good space to be. And when you're talking about our particular disciplines, we can find a lot of them when it comes to the relationship of what I've called landscapes and the machine, the whole relationship of different forms of tenure, the identity construction centered around those forms of tenure, and the problems that can arise when people have very, very different views.
Excellent, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you for your summary, and thank you watching and listening if you're listening to a podcast. So you can find out more about, I'll put links to Mike's work, as I said, and I will look forward to seeing how Mike's process and projects dynamically evolve and are able to hopefully at least help inspire and influence other land policy advisors and consultants and politicians and people dealing with these matters on the ground in various countries to realize that it isn't, well, it's never as simple as people think it might be, but it's in dealing with the complicated, the complex, and the wicked, that they are hopefully a little bit better informed, and that this has proven useful. So, thanks, Mike.
Thanks. One more thing can I mention?
Yes. My
funny little hat here is called a pakol. It's from Afghanistan, and it's a political statement. I'm just wanting to. I've spent many years. Well, I've spent many times in Afghanistan over many years, from 1976 to 2019. And I'm very concerned about the situation there. And so that's what that little hat is for.
Good. So thank you, Mike. So the disclaimer is basically that the views and opinions shared in the Customary Land podcast are those of the host, me, any guests, and any others that they may cite. They do not constitute legal or financial advice and should not be construed as such by any individual, group, or organisation. Before undertaking any dealings or action relating to customary land, individuals, groups, or organisations should obtain professional advice from a qualified lawyer, experienced valuer, and/or certified accountant with specialist expertise in your particular country. Alternatively, you can contact Customary Land Solutions for advocacy and capacity building solutions for customary and Indigenous landowning groups and trusts on land management, leasehold, valuation and resource compensation issues. Customary Land Solutions can be contacted at contact@customarylandsolutions, all one word, .com. Thanks for listening to the Customary Land podcast. I hope you found this episode interesting. If it's raised any issues for you or you'd like to get in touch, you can contact me at contact@thecustomarylandpodcast.com. Stay safe, stay well, and thanks for listening.